Welcome to the Southwark Cathedral Podcast. My name is Mark Oakley and I'm the Dean, and I have the great privilege in this podcast of speaking with Manni Coe. Manni and I spoke together not too long ago at an event at the cathedral, and we were very much encouraged after the event to do this podcast so that some of the things that we were discussing then can be revisited here and have a greater audience. So Manni, hello.
Hello, great to be with you.
If I just introduce you to our audience, Manni grew up in Yorkshire and Berkshire. He studied Latin American history and culture at Edinburgh, which took him on adventures to South America before he settled in Spain, where he works as a private guide. He's also, however, a writer, and his first book, Brother, Do You Love Me?, was a bestseller, a very tender book exploring the relationship between Manni and his brother Reuben, who has Down syndrome. Now, Manni has written Little Ruins, Rebuilding a Life, a memoir about trauma, healing, poetry, nature, and human pain and repair, and a lot more. I have to say to you that I don't think I've read such a beautiful book, beautiful in its writing, its tone, its heart, for a very long time, and I read it in 2 sittings. So I'm very delighted to be with Manni again, to thank him for it. But those of you who haven't read it, now's your time to go and buy it, and it will be available in the cathedral shop. I think we need to say before we begin that the themes of the book do include suicide and sexual abuse, domestic violence, coercion and addiction. So we do want you to be aware of that before we begin. Manni, you are at the moment going around the country talking about the book, and we're so pleased you are. But of course, talking about a book is very different from writing one, and I'm just wondering how it's feeling at the moment as you tour, talking about all the things that you've been putting onto paper.
Yes. Hi, Mark, and thank you for repeating this moment, but it was a very special moment for us all in the cathedral context, but I'm very glad to be able to talk it through with you now in a more sort of permanent format. I'm not going to lie to you, Mark, it's been tough. I'm 5 in and 3 to go. We've been travelling around Scotland and England, and it's a tough one. I feel as if every single night I'm kind of wringing out my soul, and I'm sitting within the privilege of that, but I'm also very aware that it's been emotionally taxing. I've been doing a lot of walking to try and rid myself of that sort of emotional charge that always comes after speaking about this. And you're right, writing about it was one thing. Writing, as you know, is a very personal, sacred, private space. And then as authors, we're expected to flick the switch and suddenly talk about this in a very public space. Now, I'm normally very happy to do that, and I am happy to do that, but yeah, it's been tough. And as much love and friendship and support that I know surrounds me, it ends up being ultimately quite a lonely space.
Because we write, don't we, to sometimes commune with our own privacies. And then, of course, the irony is, as soon as you've done that, you're in the public domain.
Yeah. As writing is an inward journey, and I've been excavating on a very personal level, and then all of a sudden that becomes public. I knew this time was coming, and I thought I was prepared, and I'm prepared as I could be, with lots of support from the publishers as well. But yeah, it's a tough time, to be honest.
As Sister Maria says in The Sound of Music, let's start at the very beginning.
Okay.
Can you tell us about your family and your early childhood?
Sure. I'm one of 4 boys. I'm number 2. Reuben, my brother, who has Down syndrome, is number 4. We were all born in Yorkshire, in the city of Leeds, and our childhood was full of fun and fellowship. My parents' church was the centre of their lives, and their Christianity and their faith has been the centre of their life ever since. But it was a very happy upbringing, and when Reuben was born, that forged a change in all of our lives for the better, and we ended up moving from the north of England to the south, and we moved first to Reading, and then to a more rural village in Berkshire. And this accent is not from Leeds. We were 4 northern boys in southern schools, and my northern accent got kicked out of me rather quickly. Leeds was a wonderful place to grow up, and we had a very, very strong community. And I think when we moved down south, that community was, as much as my parents tried, they were never quite able to replicate that sense of belonging that we all had in Yorkshire. So our move to the south was tough in many ways, especially for my elder brother, who was bullied. We had to move house because he was bullied. There were lots of challenges, and then obviously myself, I suffered a huge challenge that we will talk about in the course of this conversation.
On the evening where we had our first conversation together here at the cathedral, your mum was sitting on the front row. Great to see her.
She was.
And your parents feature from time to time in the book in very significant ways. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about your parents.
They met on a walking holiday in Yorkshire. My mum was a nurse, my dad was a policeman. Mum fancied my dad straight away, but he was with his sister, so she thought that was his girlfriend and spent the whole week annoyed that she hadn't got to him first. And then on the very last day, she found out that Jill wasn't his girlfriend, but was his sister. So he was available after all. So I think she threw herself at him. And they were married for almost 55 years. He died last year. And it was a tough time. Obviously, when you lose your father, it's a monumentous time in anybody's lives. But Dad was so intrinsic to this whole narrative that losing him at a time just before it was published was a very tricky time for me. There is one particular chapter that really concentrates on our father-son relationship, and gladly Dad had read that in a draft form before he died, and he'd given me his blessing. And the rewrite, the final rewrite, was in August of last year, just after I'd lost him. And I went back to our house in Spain by myself, and in the middle of grief, sort of purged myself through the final draft. And Dad has been very much a part of this whole process.
And for those who haven't read your first book, can you tell us about Reuben, your younger brother?
Darling Rubes. Everybody that knows him is affected by him. He walks into a room and ultimately changes the energy. And my first book, Brother, Do You Love Me, the title comes from a text message that he sent me when he was isolated and depressed and non-verbal during the pandemic. He got stuck in a home in Dorset, and my parents couldn't get to him. We couldn't get to him. The home was always telling us that he was fine. He was a little quiet, but that he was fine. And then in November of 2020, he sent me that text message, Brother, do you love me? And I saw that as an SOS, a call to arms, really. And I went to rescue him from care, and him and I spent 6 weeks in isolation in a little house in the middle of nowhere in Dorset, in the west of England. And the Brother, Do You Love Me really charts those 6 months that him and I were together. And I was faced with a broken brother who didn't want to eat, didn't want to be with me, didn't want to walk, didn't want to sleep. He had a psychological regression. And Brother, Do You Love Me is all about how I put him back together, how we put him back together.
And you told me that when he is introduced sometimes or described as having Down syndrome, he has a reply to that.
Yeah, he points up, and and changes the down to up. So he will only refer to it as up syndrome now. Yeah. I think it's because when he was down, he must have heard us talking about how down he was, and you don't know what to do. Reuben is so down. So when he got better and when his smile returned, he didn't feel down anymore. So now he doesn't have Down syndrome, he has up syndrome.
The book, and I was a bit cautious about saying this, with your partner also sitting on the front row that evening, but the book is peppered with early boyfriends and then comes on to the backbone of your partner who, as I say, was there that evening. The way you speak of him and your relationship together is, I feel, one of the great arteries of hope in the book. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about you both.
Sure. I remember that evening when you mentioned ex-girlfriends, there was a little giggle in the crowd. I don't think there were any there, but there were many people that knew them. So yes, you were on point to mention that. And I'm so proud when I see Jack in the book, when I see him sat there in the front row next to my mum and my brother Reuben. It's always such an incredibly proud moment for me. And I know that our love is what has given me the emotional security to be able to begin this journey of healing. I had many tumultuous relationships. I unfortunately took many wrong turns in my life, wrong turns. And finding an equal love, a balanced love, a love without fear, that was all-encompassing and all accepting, was something very new in my life. And so when Andrew and I's relationship settled down, he accepted Rubes as part of my package from the word go. That's very important to mention, and is now Reuben's primary carer. We are a trilogy. I say in the book that 2 sticks can't stand up together, but 3 can. And between them, between Jack and Reuben, they have given me this emotionally stable platform from which to begin sort of the abseiling adventure into the depths of my trauma. I don't think I would have been able to do it without them.
You say at one point in the book, I remember, that the early having of a lot of relationships, when you look back in retrospect, might have been a cover-up, a hiding. The sense that the real you was conveniently being hidden by these relationships all over.
Yeah, I think so. I lived many other people's lives, so I went from a relationship to a relationship and fell into their circle and their existence and their friendship group and their even town and location. And for many years, I think you're right. I think I was distracted by other people's lives because I didn't want to turn and face my own.
So the book begins really by you telling us that you both decide to buy a place in Spain. It's a bit of a ruin and it needs repairing. Tell us about the house. Help us imagine it, picture it, the setting, the neighbours and so on.
Yeah, it's a ruin to say the least. It was when we found it, part of it had been lived in, but the vast majority of it hadn't been lived in for over 10 years. And it was built in 1870. We think a part of the house even goes further back than that. And I say in the book and in real life, because the book charts 10 years of our lives and was written in a way that as I was healing and as I was getting ready to heal, I was writing in real time. So I think it's really important to state at this point that Little Ruins is a book where you have to trust me as a writer. I ask the reader to trust me, and I'm taking you on a journey, a very personal journey, that will reach a sense of wholeness and belonging at the very end. But yeah, this house, I said to Andrew once, I want to live in an old house made of stone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by olive trees. So in its essence, that is what it is. We found it online on the internet, and we were the first people to go and look at it. As I said, we were only going to buy half of the house, and we ended up buying the whole place, which came with a lot more land than we'd ever bargained for. And I remember seeing it for the first time. I was with my mother, with a friend, and with Reuben. And I saw it from a distance, and it was almost as if I'd seen it before. I was walking into nostalgia. I was walking into a sense of my dream, really. And I remember that my first feeling was one of fear, thinking that it might never happen. It was 3 months of arduous paperwork, and we had to jump through so many legal hoops and complicated administrative processes. For anybody that's ever bought anywhere in Spain, especially that's old, we had to pay people off ancient rural farming rights, and eventually 3 or 4 months later we were the proud owners of a bunch of keys to a house that in the book becomes its own character. I'm already getting lots of responses from people saying it's amazing how the corner as a house becomes a personality, and it's so intrinsic in this whole story.
And so we're introduced by the house into the theme of repair, and we quickly sense as we begin the book and carry on that it's not just about the repair of the home, it's you. And you come to see your need for repair after a certain incident. And I wonder if you could tell us a little of what happened to make you realise that there was this inner work to be done by you. It was a very traumatic experience.
It was. We realised very quickly that we needed help on the farm. And it is a working farm. We have animals and beehives, and we produce our own olive oil. And because Andrew and I work away a lot and Reuben was living with us, we realised we needed help. So we had a series of volunteers come and help us. Some of them helped us, some of them hindered us on our own journey. And there was one lovely guy who had been with us for about 8 months, and it was already a conversation that he wanted to stay. He'd asked us for a permanent position. We were warming to him. I had a real soft spot for him. I thought he was a wonderful guy, hard worker. But the house is such a huge metaphor because we have to ford a river to get to the house, and when it rains heavily, the river swells and we get isolated. And it's almost like living in a fortress, and you draw the drawbridge up and there's no way in and there's no way out. That for some people is their solace, and when it's what they need. And for Joe, we heard later from his family that he loved the corner and that he'd been happier there than he'd been anywhere in many, many years. But one thing that we didn't realize is that he had a huge problem, an addiction problem. And after one walkabout and then a second walkabout and then a third walkabout, from which we'd had to sort of forgive him and say, look, you can come back, but it can't happen again. The third time it happened, he'd been away for 9 days. We'd had no idea where he was. He came back in a terrible state, and it was at that point that I had to ask him to leave, reluctantly, but I had to ask him to leave, and he did leave. We thought he'd gone into the village, but this is the hard part, Mark. I found his dead body the next morning on our dog walk. And when I found him, I knew that my life was about to change. I knew that I would never be the same again. I think when you see something like that and you live such an acute trauma like that, it has to change us. And it was 72 hours of the most hideous experience with his wonderful family and translating for the civil guard and the recovery of their body. It was just a horrendous time for us all. And I had to go into therapy for that because I had quite acute PTSD. And it was when I was in therapy for that my soul was shaken, and all the sediments of earlier trauma that I thought I had dealt with, I thought I'd healed from them, but they came back to bite me.
Do you feel able to talk about then the abuse that you suffered as a boy?
Yeah, I write about it in the book, and so I am comfortable talking about it. I don't talk about it in detail. I say that chapter is quite an impressionistic version of what happened, because I don't feel I need to go into too much detail. And the power of this book, I hope, lies in the empty spaces where people can fill in the gaps by themselves as much as they need to. But yet I was an adolescent, and I was the drummer of a worship band at an evangelical church. And because our family home was 9 miles away, the decision was taken that I would spend Saturday nights in the vicarage, because we rehearsed for music practice on a Saturday night. So over a period of 2 years, when I was 14 and 15, a series of sexual abuse went on in the vicarage, where this vicar was living with his family. And I never told anybody. I locked it away. I say in the book I went for longer and longer bike rides. And I think even then, in the early days when I was dealing with all of this, I think nature became a great pull for me. I remember I used to ride through the lanes of Berkshire and go swimming in ponds. I felt, even back then, that nature was my solace. Nature was where my soul could finally rest. And I didn't tell anybody about it until I was a missionary in South America, and I signed up to do a year for God with the missionary organization YWAM, Youth with a Mission. And in that discipleship training school, there was a chapter and a week's teaching around the father heart of God. And my image of God as a father was skewed because of this man. This father had taken actually the role of father in my life. It was all very confused and convoluted. And he'd pushed my own father away from his role as a father and taken over. And therefore I couldn't see the Heavenly Father as a loving father because of what had happened. And so that was the first time I ever told anybody about it, when I was 18. And I wrote to this man because I felt that I needed to deal with it. I was 3,000 miles away from home. And so I think that's why I faced it, because I had the safety of distance. I wrote this man a letter, and he replied, admitting full responsibility. I remember him expressing shame that I, as an 18-year-old, had been the one that had to redress and begin a conversation around what had happened. He asked me for forgiveness, and then the last thing he did was he asked me to burn the letter. And Susanna, who was my youth teacher, we took the decision together to heed his word, and we burnt it. I didn't press charges. I saw him face to face when I got back, and he asked me if I was going to press charges, and I said I wasn't going to. But then when I was 21, I told my parents that I was gay. I came out to them and also told them about the abuse, and it was them that pressed charges when I was 21, when I was in the middle of my final exams at Edinburgh University. So that was a year to remember. And it never got to court through lack of evidence. And that's something that's quite key in the book. You know, we say in Spanish, a different cockerel might have crowed had I not burnt the letter. But I did burn the letter. There's no going back. A lot of this story is accepting that we cannot change the past, but we just have to face it and deal with it and heal through it. And so, yeah, a lot of this book has been about me facing what happened, realizing the consequences for me personally, and beginning that process of healing.
And you also discovered that it wasn't just you that had been abused.
Yeah, I wasn't the only one. I was invited back to see his blue file, which is a file that every clergyman, every clergy person has within the Church of England. I was invited to go back and see mine. And together with my file, there was another file on somebody else. I don't know anything because I wasn't allowed to know because of data protection. But one an advance on last week's conversation, Mark, is that this is an evolving situation for me. And in the back of my mind, I've always thought, I wonder if anybody from that church comes forward to acknowledge what happened. And at an event last week, there was somebody there that I recognized from 35 years ago. And my heart was pounding. She very, very gracefully waited until the very, very end. And then she came up and grabbed my hand. And she said, "You know who I am, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, exactly. I remember her name." And she just looked at me and she said, "I need you to know that I believe you." I don't know what other stories she knows, but it was a moment for me for sure. I went back to being a 14-year-old boy and hiding behind my drum kit. And that's the thing, is that because he was never proven guilty, he gave himself an I am innocent party, was in the local press saying, "I always knew that justice would be served. I always knew that I was innocent. And if he was innocent, therefore, what was I? I was a liar. I'd fabricated something. My parents had fabricated something. And if I look back at the timeline, when I was 21, I left England, didn't really live here, and haven't lived here ever since. Part of writing Little Ruins is about reclaiming home in all that home signifies. It's not just a physical place, but, as I travel now around the country talking about this, it is giving me a renewed sense of belonging in my own country, because I did run away from England.
Those who are listening now will understand that when you're reading this book, you do feel lots of anger as a reader. I found myself getting angry, if I'm honest, at points with your parents, but also obviously with your church, with the priest, with his wife. And there's a lot of religion in your early life, as you were saying, and in your parents' life. And it's all caught up with this abuse. And here you are now, sitting here with a priest in his dog collar. And I also believe the book to be very spiritual. But I wonder what you make now of religious institutions and its representatives.
Well, I'm one of the applicants for the redress scheme. Through my dear dad, who found out about it, he invited me to apply for compensation. And that redress scheme has 3 prongs of support. One is they're offering us, survivors as we're called, they're offering us an official apology, emotional and psychological support, and then monetary compensation. And with the safeguarding team at Oxford, the Diocese of Oxford, which is where this happened, I went to see them, and I never expected, Mark, to receive healing within a church context. So I'm sitting here with you now, and you have your dog collar on, and I am loving this time with you. I'm loving this conversation because I never thought it would happen. And I ran away from the church, and I ran away from my faith. I didn't lose my faith. Because of the trauma of everything that happened, I put it down one day in a church and walked away from it. And I think it's interesting that you've said that you think it's a very spiritual book. I'm still a spiritual guy. I walk the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, the way of St. James. I walk it 3, 4, 5 times a year. And this is, when I left the church, I had to walk away from many wagging fingers who were sort of helping me, or they weren't helping me, they were accusing me of leaving the church and finding myself without God's blessing, walking away into a God-filled hole. I've still got many handwritten letters of people saying, you have to fight this. This is not God's will for your life. As a young man, I had to take a very brave step to turn my back on all of that judgment and criticism and pleading and walk away into a center of self. I had to choose me because the alternative was so distressing. I took myself, as you know, through conversion therapy. And some members of the clergy performed an exorcism on me.
This is what some people summarize as pray away the gay.
Praying the gay away, yeah.
Yeah.
And I voluntarily took myself through that process. And it was a humiliating moment for me. Can I tell you a story? So I'm in Edinburgh right now. And yesterday was Sunday. And I had no agenda. I've got an event tonight, but I came up because I wanted to be in Edinburgh for this weekend because I knew that I had many ghosts up here. This is where I lived in my second year. This is where I lived with Matt Brownhair, who we lost in a car crash 5 days before his 21st birthday. The book is dedicated to him because Matt was helping me through this whole process of self-acceptance. I went back to see the flat where we lived together. I travelled around that city on foot yesterday, revisiting my ghosts and revisiting my past trauma. And I'm a firm believer, and this is what I preach, not preach, but this is what I say in my writing, that it's really important to go back to the very point of our pain if we are to heal as completely as we need to, especially from trauma. So there I am writing this, and I thought, well, I better put my money where my mouth is. And I went to visit this church where the exorcism took place. And I'm standing outside, and the service finishes, and people start to spill out. And I take a deep breath, and I walk in. And as I enter the body of that building, I look over to the far left, which is where we were standing when that exorcism took place. And standing on that very spot was the very man that was performing that exorcism on me. I know. My heart was on my sleeve, and I went white, apparently, and a guy came up to me and said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I need to speak to this man." So he kind of led me over there, and he shook my hand. He didn't recognize me. And I said, "I know you." And we had this talk, and I think it moved him greatly. He said, "Would it be okay if we sit down?" So we sat down and ended up talking for an hour and a half about what happened. He was appalled at his own behavior. He apologized. He couldn't believe that I was there. He'd seen an article in the Sunday Times, which came out about 3 weeks ago, about all of this. And he didn't remember me concretely, but there was something in him that thought, I need to get hold of this guy. And he asked me, was I part of your trauma? And I said, yes, you were. And we had this moment of, it was a very difficult conversation, but I'm not afraid of having difficult conversations because they take us back to where we need to be. And I was sat there on a Sunday morning with the guy that was a form of abuse. He recognized it as that. And he said, I was very young. I didn't know what I was doing. And we had a hug, and I walked out into the Edinburgh skies and spent the rest of the day sort of feeling somewhere on a plateau between elation and the memory of my trauma. And these are very difficult paths to walk, but thankfully I feel strong enough to revisit these moments. And so as I go through this process, I'm beginning to feel more and more whole, because I don't want there to be any shadows in my life, Mark. I don't want there to be any stone left unturned. I've done so much work on this that if there's an opportunity for me to go in and really that moment, maybe it wasn't so much about me, it was about gently informing him that what he did was wrong and that it had a huge effect on my life and my faith. And he said, what can I do? And I said, well, I just need you to own it. And this is the surprising thing in the response of the church, and sitting here with you and the contact that we've had. I believe that you, in your role as dean, you represent the church, even though you had nothing to do with what happened to me. But as a human being, you recognize it and have offered your support and, ongoing counsel and conversation. And I can't ask for any more.
I mean, the story that you've just told, which I haven't heard before.
I know.
It hadn't happened. It's all of a piece with your approach in the book, if I can sort of dare to say something that I felt as I was reading it, that At so many points we can feel as we're reading that everything's falling apart. And yet there is something in you that is saying, yes, things were falling apart, but from where I am now, I can also see that some things were falling into place.
Mm.
And so it's not total collapse, it is repair. And that is the beauty of the book for me. And certainly, I think the most beautiful part of the book, as I was reading it, is when you speak about your father who comes and asks you for forgiveness. Are you able to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that chapter's called On One of Lisbon's Seven Hills. And just after coming out to my parents, and my mum, bless her, didn't have any way of taking on that information. She had no network of support. And so, unfortunately, her and I didn't communicate for several months. And I went to Lisbon as part of my university degree and ended up having a mental breakdown. I couldn't get out of bed one day, which is very unlike me. And one of my friends contacted my father and let him know of the situation. And he, very, very contrary to normal character, because he was a very gentle and very careful man, didn't like to step out of line. He went to work, wrote a note and put it on his boss's desk that said, "I've gone to Lisbon. My son needs me. I don't know when I'm coming home." And got on a flight to Lisbon. And him and I had this incredible moment that I will always cherish and treasure. And on one of Lisbon's seven hills, sitting on the ramparts of the castle, he asked me to forgive him. He asked me to forgive him for not being the father that he'd always wanted to be. He asked me to forgive him for the lack of affection. He wanted me to forgive him for not protecting me from that man and not picking up on the codes and messages that maybe he should have. And in that moment, Mark, I didn't want to. And I remember just sitting there looking at his pleading face. And that question gave me a huge amount of power over him. And I realized in that right moment, I could kind of make or break him. I didn't want to forgive him because it was quite easy for me to blame him for everything that I was going through. And having someone to blame is quite useful sometimes in our lives. But I just sat there looking at him, and he said, "I'm going to sit here until you're ready to say the words." And I don't know how long it was, but it was an awful long time, maybe 45 minutes, before I was able to physically speak those words, "I forgive you, Dad." And when I did, he collapsed on the floor like a bag of bones, and I had to lift him up and hold him like a baby. And it was a reversal. I became his father, and I just held him while he wept. And I will never forget the thing when he composed himself. The first thing he said to me was, "Right, you're here with a boyfriend, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm here with a boyfriend." And he said, "I want to go and meet him." And we went out with my then boyfriend for a meal in Lisbon. And I took him back to his hotel, went to pick him up in the morning afterwards, and I couldn't find him. And I asked reception, and they hadn't seen him. And I found him in a park opposite his hotel dancing. And I went up to him, Dad, and goes, "What are you doing? What are you doing? You're going to get arrested." And he said, I haven't slept. I've been dancing and singing all night because what happened last night has changed me forever. I feel as if my life has just begun. Those were his words. I feel as if my life has just begun. And so that forgiveness, I imagine him living with that sense of guilt as a father for so many years. And this is a part that many people have picked up on in the book, yourself included, that moment is quite pivotal in the whole narrative. And I released my father into a new sense of self, unburdened, unbridled, And it was lovely to see him grow in confidence, and it was lovely for our relationship in the latter years of our time together that we really broke through. And against all the odds, because we were so different, we were able to speak each other's truths and accept them.
Story of the prodigal father.
Yes, he did see himself as the prodigal father. And actually once he loved Rembrandt, and he loved the painting by Rembrandt of the prodigal son, which sits in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And we went to see that together. We took a pilgrimage about 10 years ago, and we met in St. Petersburg, and I'd arranged a private visit with a tour guide of the museum who explained the painting. And I remember seeing Dad standing in front of it, and in the end I had to pay the guide and let her go, and saying, look, we've come this far, you've done an amazing job, but I think Dad just needs to sit with it now. And he stood in front of the painting for almost 3 hours. And then the next day I didn't have a plan, and I said, Dad, what do you want to do? We can go to St. Catherine's Winter Palace, we can go to the Fabergé Museum. And he said, no, I want to go back and see the painting. And on the second day we went back again, and I stood behind him. I have these wonderful photographs of him just pondering that wondrous painting. And he didn't want to leave because he was in the middle of it. And that's when he called himself, I am your prodigal father. And it was a really beautiful moment that I'm so glad we were able to live together.
You then say in the book that you found yourself able to say, I forgive you, to some other people, but also to yourself. And I just wondered what you feel you needed to forgive in yourself.
I think because I suppressed my sexuality for such a long time, because I was battling with it, I think I became quite duplicitous. I hurt somebody very, very badly in London. I still get hot flushes when I think of him. I tried to ask him for forgiveness, but he slammed the phone down on me. Bless him. But I know that when I broke his heart, he called me duplicitous, and I didn't know what it was. I had to look it up. And I understood that I had become duplicitous because all the way through the early years of my gay experience, I was living two lives. I was Christian, I was mission secretary of Edinburgh University, and then I was in the gay bars of Edinburgh at night, and I was living two lives that was exciting, but it formed a secrecy in me. And so therefore I know that I had to forgive myself for being too casual with other people's feelings and responsibilities. So that was a big one that I had to forgive myself for.
What about the vicar?
I did forgive him. I forgave him when I was on that discipleship training school when I was 18. I forgave him when I burnt that letter. I forgave him when I saw him face to face and he asked me if I was going to press charges, and I said no. But then, I don't know, once you've forgiven someone, can you unforgive them? I'm not sure, because I believe repentance, when you repent, it's a 180. You walk away from that act and you don't do it again. Otherwise, your apology was never sincere. And the fact that it all came back to niggle me is because he reoffended, and I had to go and testify as a 25-year-old man after he'd reoffended and testify against him. And, you know, when I had to go back and see the file on him and I saw his face again and I saw that headline, I knew I was innocent. I knew justice would always be served. Of course, that's going to stir up a lot of anger. I have an amazing therapist who has been supplied to me or given to me by the Church of England, who's a wonderful guy. And he asks me the most difficult questions, a bit like yourself. And he said to me, what might that have looked like? What would you have liked to have happened? And I said, why are you asking me that? He said, because I'm your therapist. And I said, well, it doesn't look like punishment. It doesn't look like prison for me. I wasn't about to sort of take a family man down. That's not the kind of guy I am. But there's a part of me that's just annoyed that he got to go to his grave as an innocent man. And then in talking with this therapist, they said, well, he knew. We all take our truth with us. The worldview is one thing, societal view is another, but we can't run away from our own truths. And a lot of this book has been me turning to face my own truths and come to terms with them and find peace with all of that, everything that's happened to me. And I hope that Little Ruins is a book that will lead people. I don't know how far along their own journey of healing it will take people, but it may help them to begin. And I think that the healing path is a scary one. We need people around us who love us and accept us and know us and support us. But once we begin those first initial steps, then we only just have to trust the process, because I use the labyrinth as a big metaphor.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. The labyrinth comes up a few times. I wonder if you could just say why that's an important image for you.
When I first walked to Labyrinth, which is the one in Chartres Cathedral in France, and it's an 11-circuit medieval labyrinth, and the path is so complicated and convoluted that we cannot accept it. Our logical mind can't fathom its sequencing. There are 34 switchbacks, and it's a left and a right and a left and a right and a left and a right. So it lulls you into almost a meditative state. And unlike a maze where you can get lost and you can take a wrong turning and come across a dead end, in a labyrinth there is none of that. It's one single path from beginning to end. And I've walked the labyrinth a lot for my own personal healing journey. I find it something that really helps me to calm down and focus. And I have a podcast called Life is a Labyrinth, when I've been speaking to, for the first season, 7 wonderfully brave and loving people who I've walked with back to the center of their labyrinths, and they've explained their own healing journeys from trauma. And it's been a very powerful experience for all of us, but for me particularly, especially right now, as Little Ruins has only just been published and I'm promoting it now. And I do feel that everything that's happening around the launch with you and all of these events, as emotionally taxing as they are, it's all part of my greater journey. And I can sort of claim a little bigger chunk of my healing after every event.
So as we draw to an end, the title's beautiful. Can you just tell us where it came from, Little Ruins?
Yes, it took me 4 years to write this book, and there were 9 drafts. And it started, its first working title was Confessions of a Workaway Host. That's the volunteering scheme that we used. Then it became The River of the Silent Ones, because I was breaking my silence. Then it became The Silent One. And then it was Ruin. And Ruin was its working title for the last 3 or 4 drafts. But then a friend of mine, Malele, who was my mentor at the house, he was born in the corner in our house, so he knew it back to front. When we became the new owners, he was delighted and felt that sort of the heritage of the house could now be restored. And we were great friends. And he said to me one day in Spanish, he said, "Todos tenemos una pequeña ruina dentro," which means we all have a little ruin inside us. And I asked him to say it again, and he did. And I said, "Malele, I think you've just come up with the title of the book. Little Ruins, because we all have a little ruin inside us."
Is there anything you haven't said that you would like to say here?
Well, moving on from Malili, I was going to say it just then, but then I shied away. But you've pushed me there now, so I can say it again. You didn't push me, you gently eased me. But yeah, dear Malili, and this is something that I'm still coming to terms with, Mark, but dear Malili, that friend that named the book, took his own life about 3 months ago because no one really knew how big his little ruin was. And it breaks my heart to think that he's not here. He was coming to the event in Oxford, which will be tomorrow as we're recording this. He'd never been to Oxford before. And I know he wanted to visit that city, so he was planning on coming. So tomorrow's going to be a really difficult day for me. And I think there was an urgent call within this book, because this book deals with so many traumas, but ultimately it has our mental health at the core of it, and how much we need to look after each other and be there for each other, and how important a sense of community is, and how acceptance and love is, how important all of that is. And I'm just aware even more so that this book carries an urgent call that mental health can be very fragile, and we need to walk into trauma with a very gentle pace. We can't march our way into trauma. We have to be very responsible with this whole conversation. So I know that you prefaced this talk and warned people about the issues we were going to be talking about. And at every event, we have someone from Safeguarding there. I have information about James's Place, which is a charity offering support for men in mental health crises. And yeah, it's opening up some really incredible conversations. And I'm sitting within that privilege of being able to speak to people from a place of healing. And I remember one memoir writer, when she knew I was writing this, she said, "Are you sure you're ready? Because you cannot write about this kind of trauma if you haven't arrived at a place of healing." And I considered her comment and thought to myself, yeah, I'm ready. And I was 50 last year and wanted to fold this all away, because I don't want this to mark my life. I don't want to be identified by this. But it's very much been part of my life until now. And I feel, as well as publishing Little Ruins, personally, everybody else is opening the pages on my life story, but I personally feel as if I've turned a page and have sort of passed that stage, and now can look to a new and happier future.
And of course, everybody's own pain is unique to them, but I know that reading this book will help so many people recognize, have resonances with their own little ruins. And the tone that you place those ruins in the book is just such a helpful pathway to look at your own, I think. And that's what I felt as I was reading it. And as I said the other night when we were together, a few times in the book, as you're in Spain and you're in the landscape that you've found yourself in there, you mention stags, those majestic animals. And I said that I did feel that there was something of a majestic soul in you that's discernible throughout this book, because it would be so easy to be focused and fixed in the past. But ultimately, I feel with this book there is a huge loyalty to the future, not only your own, but the future of us all, who in our various ways are caught up in this story. And it was very beautiful to see all those who love you most there that night, sort of holding you up, as it were. But as I say, although it was fantastic to have them there, I felt that this great loyalty that you have to the future also holds you up. And I hope many, many people read this book and draw from it what I did, and so many obviously had that night in the cathedral. So, Manni, thank you so much for doing this, and I know people will be helped by it, and I know that they will go out and buy the book, and I hope the rest of the tour goes really well for you.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a huge privilege, and thank you for being there.